Hi, I'm Alexandra Yates, and this is my presentation on exerting hard power, examining the relationship between the death penalty and political dissidence in Iran and Mauritania. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states the death penalty should only be applied in the most serious cases, such as murder. Since 1966, the year the ICCPR was adopted, more than two-thirds of states are abolitionists in law or practice. In spite of this, thousands have been sentenced to death over the last several decades in acts of political violence and repression. China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia have been documented using the death penalty to instill fear against political dissidents, which include religious, ethnic, and racial minorities. The study aims to examine the relationship between rises in the death penalty in a state and challenges to state authority between an abolitionist in practice and a retentionist state, Mauritania and Iran, respectively. So my hypothesis stands that during periods of political dissidence and challenges to state authority, states will experience increases in the death penalty used in cases not satisfying a reasonable maximum. So currently there is debate in terrorist literature over whether states can enact terrorism, and this research aims to show how states misuse judicial and legislative power in order to incite fear in political dissidents or create political oppression. So the first part of my analysis was obtaining data from Amnesty International, more specifically their annual death reports, and creating line charts to show the rises in death sentencings and executions in my selected case studies, which is Iran, a retentionist, and Mauritania, an abolitionist in practice. More specifically, to talk about the relationships and the validity of my research, Iran and Mauritania both identify as Islamic republics, rely on Sharia law, and have some form of theocratic governance. Mauritania is an abolitionist in practice, but continues to sentence people to death for crimes that do not satisfy a reasonable maximum, like apostasy and homosexuality. Iran is a retentionist state whose strict interpretations of Sharia law also allow death sentencings and executions not satisfying a reasonable maximum. With this in mind, the second part of my analysis was to perform a critical discourse analysis on the key identified years that were where there were rises in death sentencings and executions. Specifically, data was obtained from the annual reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, news reports, and other scholars' research to examine levels of political dissidence. So this first figure here is from the first part of my analysis to show the rates of death sentences in Mauritania over a 2-decade span between 2000 and 2019. As you can see, there's a significant rise in 2010, it's the largest. There's also another rise in 2008, a smaller one in 2015, and a more significant one again in 2019. This second figure here shows the rates of death sentencings and executions in Iran between 2000 and 2019. The most significant rise in death sentencings occurred in 2001, with a less significant one in 2011 through 2014. This figure shows that there were a lot of ones for death sentencings. However, this is not an accurate depiction of the death sentencing that occurred in Iran over this 2-decade span. In the death reports released from Amnesty, a lot of the figures that were corroborated was just a plus sign indicating that a death sentencing did occur. However, a true number or statistic was unable to be corroborated through news sources or government reports that Amnesty International researches. So death sentencings did occur during those years. However, the true number just remains unknown, and it doesn't really show an accurate depiction of the true rises that occurred in Iran. So the most significant rises and executions that occurred in Iran, however, were in 2009, and then the most significant one again in 2015. So moving on to the second part of my research, this is where I performed the critical discourse analysis, examining the political landscape of Iran and Mauritania during their respective time periods. So specifically, in Iran, the main years of rises and executions occurred in 2009 and 2015. Following the June 12, 2009 presidential election in Iran, the largest protests in a decade erupted. In the 8-week period following the presidential election and the inauguration on August 5, 2009, at least 388 executions occurred compared to the 196 executions over a 5.5-month span between January 1, 2009 to January 12, 2009. So essentially, twice as many people were executed in an 8-week span compared to 5.5-month span. And in 2015, Iran experienced a 31% rise in executions compared to 2014 that was driven by a 2010 amendment removing the right to appeal death sentences under the anti-narcotics laws. Additionally, in 2015, Iran negotiated a nuclear agreement, and some scholars interpreted a rise in hardline drug executions as related to intensifying nuclear negotiations. And so moving on to the main years of rises in death sentencings, these occurred in 2001 and 2011 through 2014. So similar to 2009, Iran had a highly contested presidential election in 2001 between reformists and religious conservatives, which resulted in the judiciary attempting to suspend reform. The judiciary is where a lot of the religious conservatives' power base was consolidated within. And these attempts were done through public prosecutions of intellectuals and political dissidents. And in December of 2010, Iran's 1997 anti-narcotics laws were amended, and the president began a securitization of domestic policies until 2013, the end of their term, which resulted in massive overcrowding of prisons. And an example of one of those policies would be the removal of the right to appeal death sentences. Additionally, it is also outlined in the International Civil and Political Covenant, Civil and Political Rights, that people should be given the right to appeal death sentences. So this is also in violation of established international norms. So moving on to the political landscape of Mauritania during their rises in death sentencings. The main years of rises occurred in 2008, 2010, 2015, and 2019. So in 2008, Mauritania actually experienced a military coup d'etat, which resulted in political turmoil and civil unrest, and terrorist attacks where 4 French tourists were actually killed. In 2010, the highest number of people were sentenced to death, including 3 Islamic militants that were sentenced to death for their role in the killing of the 4 French tourists, as previously mentioned. And I wanted to point this out because it's actually an example of using the death sentence to satisfy a reasonable maximum. However, a lot of the times these statistics and these reports do not include data on why people were sentenced to death or why people were executed. However, if you read the longer reports, you may get details such as this. And this was just an instance of an elaboration on death sentencing in Mauritania that I wasn't able to find in other years. The government also experienced more anti-government protests in 2010, which resulted in clashes with military police, and one man self-immolated in protest of government corruption in 2011. In 2015, Mauritania continued to propagandize threats of terror despite a lack of attacks since 2011. It's actually rumored that the Mauritanian government had negotiated an agreement with the Islamic militant group to stop the attacks, and there were actually documents discovered by the U.S. During the Osama bin Laden raid. However, these documents did not conclusively find if there was actually an agreement made or not, so this is still speculation. So in spite of all of this, Mauritania continued to propagandize the threat of terror, and they introduced anti-terrorist laws in 2005 and 2010, which contributed to undue process and the arbitrary detention of activists. And in 2019, a presidential election was held and met with protests, resulting in 100 arrests after demonstrations. The protests were reportedly met with aggressive and excessive force from military police. So the conclusion. There were noticeable rises in death sentencings and executions in Iran and Mauritania during years of presidential elections. A significant number were sentenced to death or executed did not satisfy a reasonable maximum. However, once again, Mauritania, there were recorded instances that did satisfy a reasonable maximum, though a lot of the statistics did not include more information on why people were sentenced to death or executed. However, it was seen that a lot of instances of people who were executed in Iran were often labeled Moharabe or Hodud, which means in enmity with God, or enemy of God, which is not an example of satisfying a reasonable maximum. This study could also be furthered with additional case studies such as China, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, the U.S., and Pakistan. However, once again, China's death sentences and executions are classified as a state secret, so they're even harder to get statistics validated than other case studies like Iran and Mauritania. Also, additional indexes to monitor political stability should be used to assess the political dissidence in the identified years. These could include the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, the Democracy Index, and the Political Stability Index, and the Abraham Index of African Governance, and the Worldwide Governance Index from the World Bank. Moreover, this research is relevant to human rights activists who advocate for the abolition of the death penalty in all circumstances. It was observed in this paper that along with rises in death sentencings and executions, additional human rights violations were perpetrated by the state, such as repression of free speech, restriction of minority religious and ethnic identities, and consolidation of state power and access of political bodies to state-approved parties and individuals. This research also contributes to a stronger foundation of international law, since the ICCPR outlines that the death penalty should only be used in the most serious of circumstances such as murder, and the second optional protocol of the Covenant explicitly abolishes capital punishment. This research promotes further examination of the roles that states can play in the perpetuation of political violence and repression through legislative and judicial tools such as the death penalty. By questioning the limitations of terrorism definitions, scholars may be better able to understand the motivations of states when experiencing challenges to authority, or state actions when experiencing rises in penal punishments. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.